Hello and welcome to some things in history that have interested me. In 1267, the English natural philosopher Roger Bacon did something that no other European had done before. He described a remarkable invention, the first ever chemical explosive discovered by man, an invention that was going to have a profound effect upon the history of Europe and indeed the history of the entire world. Roger Bacon described gunpowder. Gunpowder was first developed by the Chinese at least 2 centuries before it reached Europe. The Chinese do seem to have developed some small, perhaps experimental firearms, but they mainly seem to have used gunpowder as an explosive and as a pyrotechnic. Bombs and rockets essentially, as well as using mixtures of chemicals similar to gunpowder for their incendiary qualities. What Europeans were going to do differently is that they would focus on using gunpowder as a propellant to fire projectiles from large artillery pieces and smaller handheld weapons. Knowledge of gunpowder was most likely transmitted from China to Europe via the Islamic world, probably entering the continent through Italy, which was the part of Europe which had the strongest trading connections with the Islamic world. Gunpowder technology arrived in Europe at what was already a time of connected social and military change. For several centuries, the landed nobility of Europe had enjoyed great power and autonomy, thanks in large extent to their possession of 2 major military advantages. Firstly, their ability to fight in armour and on horseback as knights, and secondly, their possession of castles. By the early 14th century, the value of both of these military advantages was being eroded, and that would have considerable long-term consequences. Although the image of the charging knight is still very much the classic picture of medieval warfare that most people are going to have in their minds, the days of the knight's dominance were already coming to an end when gunpowder arrived on the scene, and this is largely due to an increase in the levels of training and professionalism being shown by infantry. Medieval knights had always functioned best as terror weapons. The size and speed of the horse, the intimidating appearance of the armoured man on its back, and perhaps even the knowledge of the sheer contempt with which that man viewed the lives of opponents who he perceived as his social inferiors, meant that if you were undisciplined, inexperienced, at best lightly equipped peasant forces, you were very likely to flee without a fight. During the mid to late medieval era, however, new types of infantry tactics began to be discovered, or perhaps it'd be more accurate to say that they were rediscovered, not so much by standing armies as by mercenary companies, groups of men united behind a leader with a proven track record of not only bringing them the spoils of war, but also keeping most of them alive in the process. One of the things that these groups of men began to do was to form pike blocks, a formation that bore a large resemblance to the pike phalanx of classical antiquity. A pike is essentially a very long spear, and a pike block is a unit of men armed with these weapons in formation, holding their ground and presenting a wall of spear points that a charging knight simply will not be able to approach. As the old saying goes, a horse will not charge a line of spears. Man is the only animal crazy enough to do something like that. These pike blocks went a large way towards taking the offensive initiative away from the knights who had held it for so long on the medieval battlefield. But in addition to this, improvements in missile weaponry gave ordinary peasant soldiers the ability to threaten their social superiors. Crossbows had been known to the ancient Romans, and of course bows and spears are some of the most ancient weapons in human history. But during this time period, all of those things were being improved in the way they were used to defend against and defeat knights on the battlefield. Famously, the longbow began to be used by the English, and most famously of all, by the Welsh. This weapon gave a common soldier the ability to kill a social superior from a great distance. This made all the arms and armour and training of the knight far less formidable and intimidating. All of these factors created a lot of trouble for the medieval nobility of Europe, but they could at least fall back upon their castles, fortified strong places that they could use to control land and which could, to a large extent, protect them even from royal authority. If a noble had a castle, any attempt to curtail his activities made by, say, a higher noble or the king himself was not going to be a simple police action. You couldn't simply go round and threaten this person and get them to stop doing what you didn't like. You were going to have to lay siege to their castle at vast expense and at risk of failure and humiliation if you did fail. In the face of this fact, medieval kings would often only take steps against nobles when they felt that they had no other choice. If you were a noble and you didn't push a king right to the edge, you could very often get away with an awful lot. Pinning down exactly when gunpowder weapons were first used in Europe is made a little difficult by the fact that the word artillery both predates gunpowder weapons and used to be used far more broadly than it is today. It could potentially mean almost any equipment intended to be used in a battle. Even if we restrict ourselves in our use of that word, however, to mean purely pieces of equipment intended to launch missiles at an enemy, such devices had been known and used in Europe since ancient times, though those devices utilised mechanical rather than chemical principles. Two of the best known were the ballista, essentially an oversized crossbow, and the trebuchet, which used an enormous counterweight to fling its missiles at the enemy. These older forms of artillery will by no means go away as soon as gunpowder arrives on the scene. And really, why should they? They were tried and tested forms of technology, and in certain skilled hands they could prove to be remarkably effective. At the Siege of Montaigne in 1340, for instance, an engineer amongst the defenders was apparently so skilled at building and using his trebuchet that he was able to strike the besiegers' artillery piece on only his third attempt, a remarkable achievement. Also, gunpowder weapons will need some time to really develop and mature. However, once they do, their vastly greater potential will be obvious to everybody. The first clear evidence of European gunpowder artillery comes from England. In 1327, Walter de Millemete was compiling a tract called On the Duties of Kings. Now, in this work were many pictures of older forms of artillery, and on the last vellum page he included this picture. It is indisputably an early gun. The fact that it's firing an arrow may suggest that Walter de Millemete had not actually seen one of these for himself, but merely heard it described. But note its target. This is not being used in battle, it's being used against a stronghold, fortifications. For a long time, this is going to be the primary use of gunpowder weapons. There are several reasons for this. For one thing, these early guns were so inaccurate that they couldn't be counted upon to reliably hit a smaller target as an opposing army. But perhaps the most important reason was the difficulty involved in manufacturing and transporting these early guns. Now, if you were the leader of a medieval army and you came across a situation where you realised you needed a trebuchet, you'd probably be able to build one no matter where you were. Doing so did require skill, but the materials involved were little more than wood and rope, things that would be available more or less anywhere in medieval Europe. You couldn't simply make a cannon wherever you wanted to in the same way. The materials were much harder to acquire, much harder to work with. You'd require access to a specialised foundry, most likely a workshop experienced in the making of church bells. When you think about it, these early cannons, their shape does rather resemble an elongated bell. Medieval attitudes towards gunpowder weapons were a mixture of wonder, superstition, and fear. They knew that gunpowder worked, but of course science had not yet developed to a point where they could know how gunpowder worked or why. Also, they had no idea who had invented it. Some of those Renaissance humanist thinkers who were such great admirers of classical antiquity felt that it must be an ancient Greek or Roman invention simply because it was a clever invention. But of course, this was not the case. As much as anything else, gunpowder weapons were feared for the loud noises they made. This can seem rather odd to us, this idea that groups of men who are willing to go into battle end up stepping over the dead and the wounded, blood and guts strewn all over the floor. The idea that men like this would be frightened of a loud noise can seem rather quaint and strange, but it's important to remember that today, even those of us who've never fired a firearm do still live in a world of amplifiers, rock music, ambulance sirens, chainsaws, all kinds of loud noises that we are thoroughly accustomed to hearing. If you were a medieval person and the loudest things you've ever heard in your life are raised voices, slamming doors, church bells, the falling of trees, you suddenly hear an explosion out of nowhere, it's likely to be absolutely terrifying. Man-portable gunpowder weapons developed slower than their larger artillery brethren. The early ones were little more than miniature cannons strapped to sticks, as shown in this woodcut. Now, the large artillery could be dangerous enough. There was always the risk that it would simply explode in the faces of its firers. These smaller pieces were probably even more dangerous. At least with an artillery piece you can light the fuse and run away. With this, you've got to be holding the thing when it goes off. By the late 15th century, there were man-portable gunpowder weapons that could outrange weapons like crossbows. However, the day of these weapons would not really come within the medieval era, and weapons like the longbow and the crossbow would persist in European warfare long after weapons like the ballista and the trebuchet have virtually disappeared. Primitive though these early gunpowder weapons undoubtedly were, medieval engineers were able to improve upon them in several important ways. For one thing, they were able to refine their gunpowder recipes. Now, the recipe that had been recorded by Roger Bacon in 1267 had too much charcoal and too much sulphur in it and not enough saltpeter. But within 50 years, the recipe would be considerably improved and the mixture would now be much more effective. Another improvement that was made around 1430 was that cannons began to be used to fire iron shot instead of the stone balls they'd fired previously. Now, these stone balls had been very time consuming to make. If you were willing to use crudely shaped pieces of stone, you could have them relatively quickly, but they wouldn't work very well. If you had to put the time in to polish the stone ball up so that it fitted very snugly and neatly into the barrel of your cannon, well, you could do that too, but how many of those could you really make? For another thing, if you're firing a ball made of stone at a wall made of stone, and the stone in the wall is harder than the stone in your stone missile, then the stone missile is simply going to shatter ineffectually against that stone wall. A ball of iron will of course be far more effective. Another big step forward was the introduction of what was called corned gunpowder. Now, what was this and why was it needed? The reason why it was needed was because if you'd made some gunpowder in a big container and you'd loaded it onto the back of a cart to be transported to wherever it was needed, it would rattle along on the back of that cart over the terrible roads of the era, and in these conditions the different component parts of the gunpowder were liable to separate out. In this state, gunpowder won't work, and the act of stirring it up again when it did arrive at its destination could be quite dangerous. The friction of doing that stirring could generate enough heat to cause an explosion. Corn gunpowder was made by mixing together the different elements of gunpowder with water, making a kind of paste and then allowing that paste to dry out into a sort of granular form, a bit like very coarse sand. This form of gunpowder not only stayed mixed during transport, but also, it turned out, would explode with considerably greater ferocity. All of these improvements put together, as well as improvements in metallurgy and mathematics, meant that by the early 16th century, well-engineered artillery pieces were relatively commonplace on European battlefields. These artillery pieces would not be significantly improved upon until the early 19th century. What were the nobility of Europe going to do to try to counter this threat to their castles? Well, certain techniques were tried. The tall, relatively thin walls of previous eras gave way to much shorter, squatter, thicker walls, and even more so perhaps to a greater reliance on earthworks and trench works, as shown here in this picture of the Battle of Pavia of 1525. These types of defensive techniques would probably find their ultimate expression in the much later Napoleonic Star Fort. But the reality of the situation is, strongholds would never be quite such tough nuts to crack again, and a lot of that autonomy that their possession of castles had granted to the medieval nobility is going to go away forever. The balance of power is going to shift in favour of those who have the resources to build and maintain large artillery batteries. That means nation states. Baronial revolt, so often a concern of medieval kings, is going to become virtually a thing of the past. Warfare will from now on be between these new, more modern nation states, becoming perhaps slightly less ubiquitous, but certainly larger, more organised, and more deadly. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.